Number 3, direct-to-consumer and web stores. So, look, if you haven't seen at least a dozen articles talking about D2C and web stores by, 5 to 10 different companies, then, you I don't know where you've been. You've been under a rock. Even companies like AppCharge recently just raised, I think it was 23 million off the back of this whole thing. Stash has been all over the press with Justin being the ex-founder of Twitch.
This is a no bullshit gaming show where we talk about games and their revenue in great detail, powered by our ad monetization, game design, and user acquisition triple threat expertise. Welcome to the 2.5 Gamers, the unfiltered truth served with a side of giggles. Let's not forget this is a 4 a.m. conference discussion vibe, so let's not take it too seriously. Tune in now and stay 2.5 steps ahead of the gaming industry.
Hello everyone, this is 2.5 Gamers and I am your host, Matej Lantricic. No, not really. Don't ask me why, but the wonderful team of Matej, Jakob and Felix have asked me to do a one-off monologue of who I am, John Wright. I'm VP of Mobile Games at Quali. So my predictions for 2025. So let's see if I'm trustworthy or not. Let's see if I know what I'm talking about. It's a real privilege for the team to allow me my opportunity today to talk over this stuff, and I'm really thankful for everyone who tunes in. And again, this is 2.5 Gamers with your host today, John Wright. So let's kick off, and I'm going to explain very briefly what I'm going to be talking about today. So it's officially the Christmas season. December is here, and that means that equally it's the time of the year when people start putting out their predictions for next year. Obviously, our industry is one that is ever changing, ever growing. There is new things coming up every day, and that's one of the things that I think I like and everyone else likes about the space we work in. But today, I'm going to pick out my top 10 sort of predictions and upcoming trends for 2025. So starting off at number 10. So number 10 for me is anime games. So anime games are not something that's new. We've been having anime games in gaming for, God knows, the last 20 years. Naruto, Dragon Ball Z, which I'm obviously a huge fan, have had console games coming out from the anime for a very long time. However, what I'm seeing in particular in mobile is there is a cultural shift, which anime has been a huge thing for the last, 30 years, 40 years in Asia. I think in the West, in France and the UK, maybe for the last 20, 30 years, it also had a niche following, which I'm definitely part of one of those people, the early adopters. But we are seeing now the West, including the US, really, really start gravitating towards anime. We've seen that with the adoption of Netflix, with series like One Piece, doing extremely well on both the animation and the live person version, and equally Disney Plus picking up things like Bleach, Thousand Year Blood War. But so there is definitely a cultural shift, and it's becoming more cool and trendy to like anime, play anime games, and watch and read manga. So what we have seen this year is we saw the launch of games like Solo Leveling Rise, which Jakob, Matej and I did a podcast earlier in the year about. We've also seen other games coming through, like Dungeon & Fighter Mobile reportedly made 800 million in its first month alone. And I think that anime is going to be one of the quickest growing, year-over-year growing areas for mobile. A few things I like is the production quality is very, very high. These games cost tens of millions, if not more, to build, and normally they're cross-platform, which gives an ability to go play with your mobile as well as playing on PC for a much better experience, which a lot of mobile games still haven't cracked that cross-platform play yet. So yeah. Prediction number 10, anime games are going to grow by double digits this year. So moving on to my next point. So prediction number 9 is big publishers will dominate and small studios will pivot to Steam. So I was recently at Mob Addictum. I also was at Nordic Games Festival, and equally, even at PGC at the start of the year, we have seen traditionally conferences that were very dominant for mobile start to show a lot more PC and console. And what I believe very simply is that mobile is becoming ever more a sort of a red ocean, and a lot of small developers are trying to self-publish, but because of the current challenges in the market, post-ATT and everything else, it's just meant that it's really hard for small studios to self-publish and succeed on their own. So what happens is the big publishers who have these huge, growth teams and technology and resources and tools and money, all of these guys essentially, partner with all the smaller studios and kind of gobble them up. And the ones who are not willing to allow that and work in a developer publisher format, these are the ones that I'm seeing start shifting to PCC and predominantly Steam. And like I said, I've seen it as a trend across this year at different events where people are doing this, and I think there's an attractive option in the fact that there's been a couple of solo devs this year that produced games on Steam which made millions of dollars. And I think that is a very attractive potential for small developers. However, my personal opinion is that Steam is even harder to crack than mobile. So if you're thinking about it, I would say do not think that it's a complete blue ocean. More games get launched on Steam than mobile per day, and yeah, it's a much more complex production cycle to produce a game that's good enough for console and PCC, in my opinion, versus mobile. So yeah, one to watch out for, but think about it before what you're going to do. Going into number 8, so hybrid casual evolves into casual. So this is a controversial one, but one that I stand behind. So if you remember, at Pocket Gamer in January this year, we did a live 2.5 Gamers episode where Matei, Felix, Jakob and I were recording below a venue where we were having a PGC after party, and we were having a good time, having a few drinks, letting loose, and we spoke about what exactly is hybrid, right? So this is nearly 12 months ago, and hybrid still does not have a very distinct, or depending on who you ask, it's not a very distinct definition. It really is dependent on who you ask and what they think of it. But hybrid itself, in terms of the way I look at it, has always been to do with the hybrid monetization model. So it's 30 to 50% IAP and 50 to 70% ads, and it's a hybrid monetization model. That's the way I've always looked at it. But what I've seen personally from my experiences at Quali and what I'm seeing in the rest of the market is hybrid originally. People expected it to be, say, 50% between, or halfway between, hyper and casual. So dead in the middle. What I think I've seen and what people have realised is that hybrid is not halfway between hyper and casual. It's 90% towards casual. And if anything, I would say it's more like casual light. There's a few sort of features, or maybe like P versus P, or some sort of advanced sort of clan-based systems or something like that, which detracts it really from being a full casual game in this current state. And I think all of the hybrid or the big hybrid casual games that are doing well are focusing on them becoming more casual in nature, ensuring things like their players can stay around for a year plus. Whereas I think originally Hybrid was like, oh, okay, if we keep them for a month, then we can make loads of money, and then if they churn, great. But I think that mindset has shifted and changed. And yeah, I think, look, if you look at the actual TAMs, of the total addressable market of Hybrid, as it is per sort of any of the big reports, it's saying it's about 1 to 2 billion, which is actually not a huge amount of money to go after, especially for the amount of developers trying to crack Hybrid. So if we compare that to casual, which sits at about 40 billion or even more, sometimes some people are saying it's more like 50 billion. There is a lot more to play for in the casual space if you can crack it correctly. So yeah, I think Hybrid was a stepping stone. People have realized the extra complexity which comes with it, and realizing it's very close to casual. And developers over the last 12 to 18 months have really done well learning how to succeed in building economies, understanding IAPs, ensuring that they have a much more casual sort of framework for their production, the level of polish required, the amount of meta, and essentially just having a lot more stuff in there rather than just focusing on the core loop. So yeah, my opinion, next year Hybrid just becomes casual, but maybe in a slightly casual light frame. Cool. Moving on. So number 7, transmedia and IP. So this was also something that I spoke about in my 2024 predictions. It's something that I still very much believe in, and I think there has been a number of notable examples over the last 12 months where IP has been successful. Talking about another podcast that Two and a Half Gamers and I did recently, which was the Pokemon Company's Pokemon TCGP, so trading card game Pocket launch that has generated about 140 million in the first month. Pokemon is by far the number one IP in the world, and to utilize that IP, which is based on an animation and a movie series, but one that has been sort of interlinked and very successful with games in the past, but still nonetheless still based off of an animation. This launch, purely off the back of its IP and relatively low user acquisition, has done 9 figures in the opening month, and has been only 10% below what Pokemon Go was, which is, we all know, is one of the best successes of recent year. So we've also seen a huge rise in integration. So integrations, very simply, is when we take an IP that's not associated with our game and integrate it into our game as a limited time experience. So we've seen Supercell do this a lot recently. They did Godzilla was integrated there. Also Haaland was integrated as a playable character. And a lot of the time what happens is these developers are working with these big IP companies, or the owners like Hasbro, like Mattel. They're paying either a fixed sum of money or giving a large percentage of a unique in-app purchase that's associated to getting that special character, right? So another good example I saw recently was Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, and you could effectively buy and use Leonardo as your sort of protagonist character in the game. So yeah, there's been lots of, and equally Voodoo just did this for the first time in Hybrid with Transformers, which also was a big success. And what we see is these spikes of interest and downloads because people who like the brand want to play the game with the brand in it, right? So Transformers in Voodoo created a spark off the back of brand recognition and increased installs off the back of that. Also, that brand recognition piece is also important because of marketing. So what we notice is CPIs normally drop when you have an IP or you're advertising, marketing something that has something that's recognizable. So yeah, if you're using something that is cultural, pop culture sort of trend, or something that is easily recognizable, like Optimus Prime, then of course people are going to be more inclined to click on it and then download the game off the back of that. So yeah, the IP definitely allows increased marketing by lower CPIs. It also brings organics because of the brand recognition and loyalty built by its audience. It also allows, or transmedia in general, allows cross promotion between the different mediums. So, once someone's hooked on the show, you can push them the game or vice versa. And overall, if you look at that as a transmedia LTV, then obviously the value of your user goes up dramatically if they're playing on more than one medium or engaging in more than one medium, i.e., paying for Netflix, watching the show, going to the cinema, watching the movie, and then downloading the game and spending money, right? That, if you look at that user in all those different points, is obviously very, very better, very, very, very valuable to whoever it is, the developer, the IP holder, whoever. So yeah, transmedia and IP continuing to succeed in 2025. Number 6, AI. So definitely the buzzword of the moment. We're seeing this literally everywhere. I think if you look at the bulk of gaming VCs in Europe, especially right now, and also the US, you'll see that most of the money raised lately has been either AI centric companies, tech that uses AI, or even developers using AI in game production. So we know there is a huge trend when it comes down to AI and its adoption. I use ChatGPT every day, and I have done for a very long time. I know a lot of other people in our industry also do the same. But up to yet, the real traction that AI has had within gaming has been around marketing, creative, and asset production. If you read Matei's blog, you'll see he did a really, really good article recently about how very quickly a layman like him or me could actually use a bunch of different AI tools and create a really successful, very quickly to produce asset that you could run on TikTok. And it was, using a Halloween vibe theme, and it had like Grim Reaper, long form content, which is trending very well on TikTok. And he did all of this himself without the need of artists, of designers, of motion designers, of whoever. He did this himself using AI. And that ad went on to be fairly successful. So, we've seen marketing have high adoption, even UGC actors, which has become a thing, right? Training an AI to pretend to be a certain type of user who looks like in a certain way that talks to your audience about something. Like this is without having to pay like a real person the amount of money we normally do. So that's obviously a cost saving aspect. But all in all, that is gone very well. We've also seen the adoption of AI in mimicking user behavior for QA. So QA engineers are now building AI sort of plugins, to the game, or in the level design, to really kind of focus on mimicking user behavior, so that an actual QA person doesn't need to go through and play the game or play the level. To do that, the AI can mimic the behavior, and then it can report back all of that information, and then the developers can then fix or change or whatever based on the churn analysis they would see from that level. So that's where we've seen the two big adoptions. But my prediction for 2025 is that we'll see the first successful game where over 50% of its foundation, such as the core loop or the base code for the game mechanic or the initial documentation like GDD, all of that will be generated by AI. So what that means is someone will train a model to create a market-leading game. And again, this could be purely creating different core loops in a prototype format. So training an AI to create a large amount of prototypes. I think that is completely possible. And then what I expect to happen is for that prototype, once it's successful and we've tested it and markability is good and day one retention, etc., or session time is session length is good, then I expect the developer to then throw real people at it. So use AI to help with the initial conception and the foundation. And then when you want to make a really well polished game with lots of content and throwing, again, things like meta into it, that's when you get your team of developers to work on it and execute on the best game possible. So that's my prediction. AI will help create core loops and initial prototypes, and then strong teams will help finish them. Number 5, walled gardens continue to win. So again, something that's been well documented. Eric Seufert has been speaking about this for a very long time. And I think essentially he's been knocking on the right door. I think there's another way to approach this. There's the aspect of Apple and Google losing with the DMA. So in Europe, the DMA has disabled the monopoly or duopoly that these two platforms have within gaming. So we're starting seeing the rise of that, and direct to consumer stores, etc. We'll talk about later in one of our other trends. But equally, we've seen another big example of this, which is the recent example of AppLovin versus Unity. And AppLovin, as of the last time I checked, was about $412 per share, which compared to a couple of months ago where it was about $150, $180, has grown dramatically, and is now, I think, 12, 13 times bigger than Unity. And there was a point where Unity was bigger than AppLovin in the not so distant past. So, the fact that these big successful companies with large data pools have been able to corner off and create these walled gardens of their users, and they've been able to do that very successfully. And I think once you create these walled gardens, once you've cornered off those users and you've been able to keep that user within your ecosystem. And look, if we look at AppLovin, they did the Mopub acquisition, they did the Adjust acquisition, they did a number of studio acquisitions, they have the Max acquisition, because Max obviously wasn't originally a product they developed, they acquired it and then built that in. So they've been great at buying different companies that have lots of different data points and stitching all those users together and building an incredible sort of environment that has become the most successful tech company of the year, by establishing those sort of walled gardens. And I think once users are now in that environment, it's very hard for them to get out. And I think, other tech companies like Unity are going to struggle to compete against AppLovin until some form of innovation comes along and can hopefully restabilize or give a bit of fair competition. Number 4, privacy will worsen before it gets better. So one of my 2024 predictions was that Google Sandbox / privacy would start to really affect user acquisition on Android the same way that IDFA deprecation and ATT did for iOS a couple of years ago. That doesn't seem to have happened. However, depending on who you speak to at Google, it's already underway, or it's not really fully there yet, or it hasn't started. It really is hard to kind of get a clear answer. But I think, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen in 2025. So I do think that privacy will become, again, Google will start moving towards more this direction. And with, IDFA deprecation, we saw a industry average of around 30% drop in iOS user acquisition through CPIs becoming more expensive and quality of targeting, so CPMs going down. So what we were hit with a double negative, right? We saw higher CAC and lower LTV, which made things worse, and ultimately why launching games has never been more difficult on iOS. I do think that there's going to be a similar trend in Android. However, I don't think it will be as much, because Apple are a privacy first business. It's part of their marketing strategy. Google are an ads first business, and that's where they get the bulk of their revenue. So I don't think they would be as aggressive. So I do think there'll be some downturn, but I don't think it'll be as much as what iOS was. I think probably somewhere in like range of 15 to 20% rather than 30%. So let's see. But good news, companies like AppsFlyer and GeekLab are developing technology now to better help you target users, which will hopefully try and, again, rebalance that sort of hard times of the last few years. So definitely check out what those two are doing right now. Right, going into the top three, and hopefully the three that I think are going to be the most impactful and the ones that ideally you've already heard about, but maybe haven't gone into too much detail yet. So, number 3, direct-to-consumer and web stores. So, look, if you haven't seen at least a dozen articles talking about D2C and web stores by, I don't know, 5 to 10 different companies, then, you know, you I don't know where you've been. You've been under a rock. Even companies like AppCharge recently just raised, I think it was 23 million off the back of this whole thing. Stash has been all over the press with, you know, with Justin being the ex-founder of Twitch, and, you know, a number of other, you know, big companies really sort of trying to hammer this home. But obviously it all comes off the back of the DMA and the success of the DMA and Apple being sued for a, you know, X number of billion. And look, what's hard to understand? If by integrating a direct-to-consumer store off the app allows you to reduce the amount of fees you pay for IAPs, especially if you're an IAP-centric game. And as we were talking about earlier with Hybrid's evolution into casual, if we're going to start seeing 50-50s, even Hybrid developers will start to look to implement, or, you know, to these type of stores, because look, 50% of revenue, and where you can save maybe 10, 20%, that starts equating to millions of dollars of profit. And, you know, studios right now need to focus on EBITDA. It's about, becoming profitable. It's about being self-sustained, and yeah, it's just really important that people start to focus on this. And I think, again, even Hybrid developers in the next 12 months will start to have this strategy. We've already seen mid-core and traditional puzzle games companies start actually generating more revenue and profit from these kind of stores versus actually through Apple or Google. So, we are seeing those early adopters in mid-core and strategy have real success, and I think the rest of the industry will start following. It's definitely one of the big ones to watch. Number 2, alternative stores. So this is another one which is kind of coming off the back of the DMA. So alternative stores, historically, and again, if we look at things like the Epic Games win against Apple, we're seeing the grip loosen across that duopoly of Apple and Google. We are starting to see other stores scale up and find success. And look, a great one, an observation that I saw recently was Amazon. Amazon's LTV, or the user LTV for games in general, is anywhere between 20 and 40% higher iOS and Google. It's not hard to work out why, because with Amazon you need to have Amazon Prime account, and if you're going to spend £100 a year on something like a free delivery service like Amazon Prime is, and then obviously like the TV and the music and all of that stuff, like you have to have disposable cash, right? You have to have more, have money to be able to do that, to warrant that. So, the fact is you're going to get higher LTV users because the user's been somewhat validated by their purchase behaviour and being able to afford a nicety like Prime. So that makes sense. But equally, it's a really good thing to do, good thing to observe and good thing to test out. Equally, there's been a huge sort of expansion by people like Samsung, people like Huawei, One Store, and there's even technology out there in the market like Kiln that actually aggregates all of this for you and allows you to basically push out your games onto multiple stores. And look, if you look at the Android ecosystem in China, there's, I think, around 300 alternative stores. So, being able to tap into all of this, it gives you incremental users, it gives you incremental revenues, it gives you, a real ability to start making more money. And normally these stores take a smaller percentage. So if you say Apple and Google take 30%, I think the alternative stores normally take anywhere between 12 and 20%. So in some areas you might be halving that cost component from paying Apple and Google. So it's a real good thing to do. And look, I want to give a special shout out to Epic Games and Sarah, who's their director of BizDev. She's doing some fantastic work on getting, developers onboarded and ready to launch. And look, Epic are doing some great stuff on PCC, have done for a long time. And I think there's a real chance that Epic could come to mobile and do something really well. And then finally, my number one trend for next year is HTML5 games. So again, something that is not new. This is something that's over a decade old, but I think people have started to leverage it as a strategy to help with the fact that we have seen this decline in Apple and Google, this increased costs from everything that we're paying for iApps. And look, if you're able to port a WebGL version of the game and then convert it to HTML5 from Unity, which is not the most difficult thing to do, and there's plenty of porting companies out there who can do this for X number of $1,000. If you're able to then have something that is compatible in this format, you can then take it to platforms like WeChat, like Telegram, which are growing massively. And again, if you look at some of the 2.5 Gamers website episodes which focus on Telegram and WeChat in particular, WeChat games are generating millions a day. So there's a massive opportunity and an ecosystem there that's kind of been untapped by the Western world, which the Asian developers are really finding success on. And I would definitely suggest looking at those two in particular because they've already got very large engaged audiences, right? These are messaging services. People use them on a day-to-day basis. They're living in that environment. If they then get to see a game, then they're going to play it and then they're going to stay there. It makes a lot of sense. Equally, we just saw, Meta Instant Games on iOS allow integrations for iApps for the first time, which is new. And we've also seen double-digit growth by companies like Pokey and Crazy Games, which again are doing great work. They're establishing ecosystems. It reminds me very much like what miniclip.com was for me when I was growing up. And it allows developers, again, other places to target users, to get ad revenue, to get iApp revenue, which without paying the same amount of money to Apple and Google. And I just think it's low penetration because you've already got the games and you can just port them to WebGL and then HTML5. There's already established platforms, so you can push it out to large audiences, so you're not having a scaling issue. The scale's already there. You're paying less overall because, again, the cost component and what they charge is much less than the traditional providers and Apple and Google. And overall, it's an area where you can really just start generating more money and finding success. And that is ultimately why I think it's my number one prediction for this year is more and more studios will start adopting H5. More and more studios will start seeing bigger percentages of their revenue breakdown from H5. And I think it's going to continue. So, yeah, I am bullish on that. And these were my 10 predictions and trends for 2025. So I just want to thank everyone who sat here for the entirety of this, hearing me talk. Hopefully you found it interesting, and I was able to say some stuff that, rings home and rings true to the audience. And yeah, look, I'd really like to thank, Matej, Jakob, and Felix for allowing me the opportunity to do this. So thank you for listening, and have a good day. Bye.